All right, so today we're diving deep into this
Okay.
this crazy case of Ji Ik-cho,
Oh, yeah.
this South Korean businessman
Right.
kidnapped and murdered in the Philippines in 2016.
Yeah. And the crazy thing is it was police officers who did it
Yeah, police officers.
during the
Yeah.
during the Philippine drug war.
Right in the middle of the drug war.
This is pretty wild.
It's pretty intense.
Yeah. So, for this one, you sent over a Wikipedia article
Yeah.
that lays out like the kind of the basic story.
Yeah.
You sent over some court documents and then also a Reuters piece
Right.
that kind of looks at the political impact.
Yeah, the fallout.
Yeah, so I guess what we're trying to figure out today is like how could something like this happen?
Yeah, like how
What does it
How does this even happen?
what does it tell us about like corruption power
Yeah.
and when a system just goes completely off the rails?
Totally. Yeah, like when the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who are doing these things.
Scary stuff.
No kidding. Okay,
Yeah.
let's try to lay out what happened.
Okay.
So October 18th, 2016,
Mm-hmm.
Ji Ik-cho is at home in Angeles City, Philippines,
Yeah.
and he's kidnapped.
And it's not like a random street crime. This is
Right.
this is at his home.
From his home.
Later on, we find out he was actually killed inside Camp Crame, which is the Philippine National Police headquarters.
Oh, wow.
Like, to talk about audacity.
Yeah, right? Like they weren't even trying to hide.
No.
So they start demanding a ransom from his wife.
Mm-hmm.
They end up getting 5 million Philippine pesos.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, by that point,
He was already dead.
he was already dead.
Yeah, and the way they got rid of the body is pretty chilling.
Yeah.
They strangled him, they took him to a funeral home, they cremated him, and then flushed the ashes down the toilet.
Wow.
It's like they're trying to erase him completely.
Jeez, that's awful. Okay, so who are these guys?
Okay, so the leader of the group was SPO3, Ricky Santa Isabel, but the alleged mastermind was Superintendent Rafael de Malao III. And then Luzo's case is actually really interesting from a legal perspective.
Okay.
So he was actually acquitted
Oh, wow.
at first, and then he was convicted in 2024 on appeal.
Wow.
And they rely heavily on witness testimony, but the court questioned the credibility of some of the witnesses,
Okay.
like Corporal Christopher Baldovino and Master Sergeant Roy Villegas, because their stories didn't quite add up.
Okay, so you've got conflicting accounts. You've got this legal battle.
Yeah, it's a real mess.
That drags on for years. But, like, can we zoom out for a sec?
Sure.
Because this is all happening during the Philippine drug war.
Right. This
Yeah.
is peak drug war time.
Yeah, and so just to remind everybody, President Duterte's war on drugs
Right.
was incredibly controversial.
Yeah, it was
Tons of violence.
reports of extrajudicial killings, human rights violations.
Yeah, it was a really dark time.
Yeah, and you could say that chaos and that fear
Yeah.
actually provided cover for some corrupt officials to kind of exploit the situation.
So this case of Ji Ik-cho is like
Yeah.
a terrible example of how that war on drugs
Right.
could be twisted and used for like personal gain.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is, Duterte was really, very strongly defending his police force, even when everyone else was criticizing them. But when this happened,
Right.
it blew up internationally, and it was like this massive incident, and he had to do something. He actually ended up suspending the police from the drug war.
Whoa, okay, so
Huge.
this one case
Yeah.
involving a South Korean businessman ends up like flipping the entire drug war strategy on its head.
On its head, yeah. And it really shows you how much international pressure matters, especially from, a key ally and an economic partner like South Korea.
Makes sense.
They invest a lot in the Philippines. They provide a lot of military support. He can't afford to ignore them.
So you've got this international incident.
Yeah.
You've got the Philippines under fire. You've got this whole drug war strategy getting like completely reevaluated.
Yeah. It's crazy how one case can have all these ripple effects.
It really is. So if this was such a high-profile case,
Yeah.
like, what was the motive behind all of this?
Yeah. That's the big question.
Was it just about the ransom money?
Yeah. Was he seen as a threat?
Or was this like just a brutal display of power?
Yeah. Or was it something else entirely?
Yeah. I remember reading about this Korean mafia theory.
Oh, right. Yeah. So the Philippine authorities tried to push that early on, but it doesn't really hold up when you consider all the evidence pointing to the police being involved.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty weak attempt to deflect blame.
It does, yeah.
So if we set that theory aside,
Right.
you've got the extortion, obviously, because they demanded the ransom,
Right.
but it was so brutal,
Yeah.
and they tried to hide the body so meticulously.
It feels like there's something more there.
Right.
I think you really have to consider the psychology of it, you know? It's possible that in their minds, he wasn't even a real person anymore. He was just an obstacle.
That's disturbing.
And it's something we've seen before, you know,
Right.
with corruption and abuse of power. When people in authority start to see others as disposable, it becomes easier to do these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's really about this culture of impunity,
Exactly.
where people think they can get away with anything.
Where there's no accountability.
Yeah, scared.
It makes you wonder, you know, could this have been prevented? What needs to change so that the people who are supposed to protect us don't become the monsters?
That's a huge question, and one we'll definitely be grappling with as we keep going. We'll be back in a moment to unpack the international fallout and what happened in the fight for justice.
So, you know, this whole thing blows up, right?
Yeah.
And South Korea is not happy about it.
I can imagine.
So, the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs called in officials from the Philippine embassy in Seoul,
Right.
and they basically read them the Riot Act.
Oh.
Now, they didn't go so far as to file an official diplomatic protest or anything,
Right.
but they made it very clear that they wanted swift justice for Ji Ik-jo,
Right.
and they wanted better security measures for South Koreans living in the Philippines.
So they're really putting the pressure on.
Oh, yeah.
Did the Philippines do anything to, like, address their concerns?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs promised to cooperate fully with the investigation.
Yeah.
And get this, President Duterte himself actually apologized to South Korea.
Whoa, seriously?
Yeah.
That's a big deal, considering how much he had been defending the police before.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been a tough pill to swallow.
Huge moment.
He even went so far as to say that if the guys who did it were ever imprisoned, it would be best for them to try and escape.
Why?
And that he would have them killed and their heads sent to South Korea.
Whoa, okay, that's
Pretty intense, right?
a little intense.
Yeah, it was a shocking statement for sure, but it showed how seriously he was taking this and how desperate he was to, like, smooth things over with South Korea.
Yeah, I guess you could say his methods were a bit unconventional,
A little bit.
but it definitely got the message across that he was serious about holding people accountable.
For sure, there was a lot of criticism about the way he said it.
Right.
But at the end of the day, he was taking action and trying to, you know, make things right.
It's crazy how this one case managed to, like, completely derail this major national policy.
It is. It really shows you the power of international pressure,
Yeah.
you know, especially when it comes from a key ally and an economic partner like South Korea.
Right.
I mean, we talked about before how much they invest in the Philippines. They provide a lot of military aid.
Yeah.
Duterte can't afford to alienate them.
So, like, one guy's actions have consequences
Big time.
that are felt far beyond his own backyard.
Totally. And this wasn't just some internal Philippine issue, right? This is an international incident. It could impact diplomacy, trade, security cooperation. It was a big deal.
What about the South Korean community in the Philippines?
Oh, yeah.
They were pretty vocal about this whole thing, right?
Oh, they were a huge part of this. They held vigils. They organized protests.
Yeah.
They made sure that Ji Ik-jo's case did not fade away.
Right.
They demanded justice not just for him, but for their own safety, too.
It's really powerful to see how they rallied together and refused to let this be swept under the rug.
Totally. And they were a constant reminder that this wasn't just about politics or diplomacy. This was about a human life that had been taken.
Yeah.
And their grief and outrage resonated so widely.
It's a good reminder that behind all the legal battles and the political maneuvering, there are real people dealing with real pain.
Absolutely. And it was their voices, their stories, that really drove home the human cost of this whole tragedy.
Yuma, we've talked a lot about the perpetrators and the politics and the international fallout.
Yeah.
But what about Ji Ik-jo himself? Like, what do we actually know about his life?
Yeah.
And how did his death affect his family?
So Ji Ik-jo was a successful businessman.
Okay.
He had moved to the Philippines to build a better life for himself and his family.
Mhm.
He was running a company that provided workers for online gambling businesses.
It's just heartbreaking to imagine what his family went through.
I know.
Losing a husband, a father, all because of this senseless violence.
And his wife, Choi Kung-jin, has been incredibly strong throughout all of this. I mean,
Yeah.
she worked tirelessly to get justice for her husband,
Mm-hmm.
cooperating with the authorities, speaking out publicly.
That's amazing.
It's really inspiring.
It really shows you the power of love and that pursuit of justice,
For sure.
even when you're facing something so horrific.
And her story reminds us that beyond the headlines and the court cases, there are real people trying to pick up the pieces and rebuild their lives.
It's a reminder that justice isn't just about punishing the guilty.
Right.
It's about acknowledging the suffering of the victims
Absolutely.
and making sure that something like this never happens again.
And in that sense, the fight for justice for Ji Ik-jo continues.
Yeah, it's a fight that goes beyond borders, beyond legal systems, beyond political agendas.
He does.
It's a fight for a world where every life is valued and protected,
Yeah.
and where people in power are held accountable for their actions.
It's a fight worth fighting, even if it takes a lifetime.
Well said, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
But there's one more piece of this puzzle that we need to look at.
Okay.
The trial itself and all the legal complexities that came with it. So the trial, right?
Yeah.
I got to say, the legal proceedings in this case were crazy.
Yeah, it was a long and complicated process, that's for sure.
Conflicting testimonies, changing stories, legal challenges, you name it. This case had it.
It did.
So we know that a few different people were arrested for this crime.
Right.
Can you kind of break down who they were and what they supposedly did?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had SPO3, Ricky Stay Isabel. He was the police officer who led the kidnapping itself.
Okay.
Then we had Jerry Omlang. He was a former agent from the National Bureau of Investigation.
Interesting.
Kind of surprising to see someone from the NBI mixed up in all this.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Superintendent Raphael Dumlau III, the alleged mastermind behind it all.
So you've got police officers and you've got somebody from the NBI.
Yeah, it really makes you think this wasn't just like
Right.
a couple of bad apples. This was a bigger problem.
So what were the actual charges they were facing?
So they were hit with a whole bunch of charges. Kidnapping with homicide.
Okay.
Kidnapping with serious illegal detention carnapping.
Wow. Okay. So
Yeah, some serious accusations.
what happened when the case actually went to trial?
So the trial dragged on forever.
Okay.
The court heard from a ton of witnesses, including Ji Ik-jo's house helper, who was actually kidnapped with him,
Right.
but then later released.
So her testimony must have been pretty crucial for the prosecution.
Oh, it was huge, yeah.
Yeah.
But there were some issues. The court actually questioned the credibility of a couple of the witnesses, Corporal Christopher Baldovino and Master Sergeant Roy Villegas,
Yeah.
because their stories kept changing.
Right. Well, that's not surprising. I mean, when you're dealing with people who might have been involved themselves, it's hard to know if you can trust what they're saying.
Right, exactly. It makes it hard for the prosecution to prove their case.
So what was the verdict?
So in June of 2023, the Angeles City Regional Trial Court Branch 60 found SPO3, Ricky Sta Isabel, and Jerry Omlang guilty of kidnapping and killing Ji Ik-jo, as well as kidnapping his house helper and carnapping.
Okay.
They were sentenced to reclusion perpetua.
Reclusion perpetua. What is that?
That's basically imprisonment for like a maximum of 40 years.
Oh, wow.
So they're going away for a very long time.
Okay, so those guys at least
Yeah.
got what was coming to them. What about Superintendent Raphael Dumlau III,
Right.
the alleged mastermind?
So here's where it gets interesting. The court actually acquitted Dumlau of all charges.
Oh, wow. Really?
The prosecution tried to argue that he had authorized the whole operation,
Mm-hmm.
but the court said there wasn't enough evidence to directly link him to the crime.
That must have been a huge blow for the prosecution.
It was, but they appealed the decision,
Okay.
arguing that the lower court had gotten it wrong,
Right.
that there was plenty of evidence to convict Dumlau.
So this legal battle just keeps going.
And then plot twist.
Okay.
The Court of Appeals overturned the lower court's decision in July 2024 and convicted Dumlau of kidnapping and homicide.
Oh, wow.
He was given the same sentence as Stad Isabel and Omlang reclusion perpetua.
So after all that back and forth,
Yeah.
the alleged mastermind is finally held accountable.
It was a big win for the prosecution and everyone who was fighting for justice in this case.
It shows that even with all this complexity and powerful people sometimes,
Yeah.
the system can actually work.
Sometimes.
Man, this whole case has been crazy, hasn't it?
It has.
The kidnapping, the murder inside police headquarters, ransom demands, the cover-up, the international fallout, the drug war playing a role in the background. It's both fascinating and disturbing.
Yeah. It really is. I think it exposes the dark side of human nature. The greed, the corruption, the violence that can happen when people in power abuse their trust.
And it highlights how important it is to have things like a free press,
Right.
international pressure,
Absolutely.
everyday people refusing to give up on the fight for justice.
Exactly. This case reminds us we can't just sit back and assume everything's going to be okay. The fight for accountability and for human rights never ends.
It requires us to be vigilant, to speak up, to hold people in power to a higher standard.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
G. Ik-jo's story is a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is a long and winding road, but it's a road worth traveling. It's been a heavy deep dive, but I hope it's given you some things to think about.
Yeah, me too. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, but cases like this remind us that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
Thank you so much for walking us through all of this. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
My pleasure.
And to you listening, we hope this deep dive has encouraged you to stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. We'll see you next time.